Chapter 16 Dreamers. Sung Lan sat still in the dark, eyes closed but senses awake. Xingjin was a warm presence resting up against him, and by now it was hard to remember a time that he wouldn't. He'd lie down at an entirely appropriate distance, and then slumping up against him, curling into him as soon as he was asleep. In the dark, he felt his lips twitch into a smile. A sense of wonder, still sending head and heart spinning, remembering the touch against those lips only hours earlier. Xingjin had come back downstairs after being gone only a few moments. A deeply thoughtful look on his face, and his own instant reaction had been vast relief. He had been deeply adverse to the idea of him going to face a murderous Xu Yang alone, but was forced to admit that coming along probably wouldn't help settle any ruffled feathers, reluctantly trusting Xingjin's judgment in this. Xingjin sat down, still pensive, and Sung Lan poured him a cup of tea, then one for himself. "Are you all right?" "Yes, it's fine, I think." "You shouldn't have had to apologize," he couldn't help but state, disapproving, not of the gesture, but the mere idea that it was demanded in the first place. "You did nothing wrong." Xingjin smiled sadly and accepted his cup, taking a sip. "Sometimes you hurt people even when you don't mean to. It doesn't make the hurt less real. I was thoughtless and inadvertently tore at an old pain, shared in confidence. Of course I should apologize for that." Sung Lan remembered dark haze half lifting as one of the nails in his skull was ripped out, watching Xu Yang, wearing Xingjin's face, play the wounded victim to perfection, easily gaining the trust and sympathy of Wei Wuxian and the young masters of various clans, knowing exactly how to play his act to get right to their hearts. Up against any performance like that, a soft, vulnerable heart like Xingjin's never stood a chance. He chose not to speak his thoughts out loud, however, knowing it would only upset him. Only doubled down for the 100th time on his own silent vow to keep very vigil for them both. "I finished the letters," he said instead, guiding Xingjin's hand to the neat pile of papers. The look on his face as he lightly traced them with his fingers was so radiant it almost felt like a second death to watch, heart aching and breath stolen, an expression full of soft awe, hope, and happiness. "This, Zijin, if this works..." Xingjin laughed, slightly breathless, and Sung Lan couldn't hold back a smile at his unbridled enthusiasm. "A change for the better. We'll carve channels." Somehow Xingjin's face softened into something sweeter still. "Oh, Zijin, yes." Sung Lan lifted his own hand to rest it on Xingjin's upon the letters. A new dream, or perhaps the same old one, only given different form. A beginning, here, on the other side of what he thought would be the end. Xingjin laid his own hand on top of his, giving that light squeeze that never failed to make his heart jump. He was still smiling, but there was something fragile on his face, close to tears. "I'm so grateful," he said, voice strangled soft with emotion. "So grateful to get to have this, all of this. I never thought I could. I wandered alone for so long, thought I had lost all joy forever. But you're here now. We are all here now, building this together." He bristled briefly at the all, but surely Xingjin had meant both, nothing else. "We're here now, together," he assured. "I will never leave you again." "Zijin," Xingjin said again, so softly, making his name a blessing, something precious in his mouth. "You, most of all, I'm grateful for you. I was so lost without you. Whenever I lose my bearings, it is the thought of you I turn to, your simplicity, patience, compassion. I see the truth of the universe in you." It was the artless honesty that broke him, and suddenly there were tears stinging his eyes. He would never deserve that simple reverence in 1,000 lifetimes, but would thrive to be worthy of it in each and every one. The tea room was empty and silent at this late hour, a few candles and lanterns left at their table the only faint light, and it was really the easiest thing in the world to lean in and be met halfway for the softest of kisses. Just a brief brush of lips, and he pulled away, breathless. Xingjian's face was flushed pink, and he looked almost bashful, yet utterly pleased. "We should get some sleep," Songlan weakly managed, after far too long of trying to catch the breath he technically didn't need, certain for a dizzying moment that Xingjian was about to lean back in again, kicking himself for withdrawing, but desperately needing the space. Suddenly acutely aware of the coin wedged in his tongueless mouth, aware of being something dead. Hesitant, for more reasons than ever, to touch or be touched. "We've had a long day." Xingjian laughed at him, could probably guess at least part of what he was thinking, but it was so warm and fond he was not the least bit offended. "We have. We've certainly earned our rest." The moment was broken, and smiling Xingjian untangled their hands and began collecting the discarded papers off the floor. Better not leave such things around for just anyone to read, supposedly. Though whose eyes could possibly be more untrustworthy than Xu Yang's could be debated. Still somewhat dazed, Songlan gathered the final versions of the letters in his hands, something precious, a dream given first solid form. Xingjian stood up beside him, and he conscientiously blew out the candles, then picked up the remaining lantern in his other hand and followed him up the stairs to their room. Xu Yang had claimed the daybed by the window, tensely curled up with his back turned and breathing in a way he'd grown to recognize in Tanzhou as not actually asleep but refusing to talk to you, which suited him just fine. Ignoring him, he set the lantern down at a low table and bolted the door. Xingjian was gracefully shedding his outer robes, neatly folding and draping them over a footstool, then stepping out of his boots to sit down on the bed. For a moment Songlan's mind went blank, which was ridiculous. They had slept in the same bed 100, 1,000 times in the past. But his lips still tingled, and he suddenly hesitated, wondered if that meant things were different now, somehow. Xingjian smiled up at him, so softly. "Will you watch over me while I sleep?" he asked, echoing the words he had assured so many times on the road leading here, and his hesitation instantly slunk away, chastised. "Always," he replied, seriously, walking around the bed to sit down on the other side of it, cross-legged and straight-backed. A guardian in the night to keep any evil thing at a safe distance, including, and perhaps particularly, the serpent sharing the room with them. Xingjian smiled at him again and settled down, curling up in a blanket, his breathing soon deep and even. Less than half an incense stick later he had rolled over in his sleep, resting his head against his thigh, giving little soft and entirely human snores. The lantern finally flickered and went out. And in the dark, something hollowed out and filled to the brim at once. Songlan couldn't help but smile. Xu Yang must have slept in the end, he figured, if only because he woke to washed-out dawnlight with a too familiar start, trying to listen over the thundering of his hammering heart for the sound of Xiao Xingjian's breathing. It had been several weeks since the man had stepped from his coffin back into the world of the living, and still Xu Yang flinched awake several times a night with the same gut-clenching dread, having to make sure it wasn't all just another of 1,000 cruel dreams, to be torn out of his grasp the moment he opened his eyes. Quiet, undignified snores could be heard from the direction of the bed, however, and his heart clenched again for entirely different reasons. Idiot Xiao Xingjian, who would as often as not shove his head face down into the bedding in his sleep, half choking on blankets or his own hair. He would be warm and limp, he knew, hair muddled and blindfold tilted slightly askew. Never more human, less moonlight than after a night asleep. Xu Yang kept his eyes closed for a long while and let his own rugged breathing fall in tune, just listening, remembering, aching with longing. Unable to resist, he finally sat up and turned to look, found Xiao Xingjian sprawled just as he'd known he would, face down in a mess of scrunched-up blankets and pillows. Unfortunately, he also found Song Lan staring coldly at him, sitting cross-legged on the bed at Xiao Xingden's side, and at once every last particle of him roared in hatred, howled to kill. He had no right to be here, be part of this picture, should have stayed mindless and dead, should have never shown his ugly face in Yi City in the first place. Xiao Xingden's limp arm was draped across one of his ankles. If Xu Yang had known himself to be utterly heartless, the sight of it could have killed him. Snarling low in his chest, he stood and jerkily tucked on his overcoat, far clumsier one-armed than he'd like to be in front of anyone, but Song Lan in particular. He stomped his feet into his boots and kept stomping onward, heading for the door, suddenly needing desperately to be anywhere but here, faced with those contemptuous eyes, Xiao Xingden's delicate hand resting in that undeserving lap. Someone was bound to die, horribly, messily, soon, if he stayed. Where are you going? Maybe someone was bound to die anyway, he decided, itching for a good, gory murder to vent his rage. The outhouse, he sneered, honey and poison. I didn't realize I needed your permission to go piss. Song Lan didn't reply, just let his aloof face crunch up further in contempt and mistrust, looking as though he was about to forbid him from going off anywhere alone. He was welcome to try. I can stay, he intercepted sweetly, gifting the presumptuous Dao Shi his vilest grin. I can go right here, if you feel like offering up your boots for buckets. Please don't, Xiao Xingden said, voice still slurred and sleepy, raising his head from the bed, because of course he had woken up just in time to hear that. With a wordless, guttural sound of frustration, Xu Yang snatched the bolt aside and kicked the door open, before the sight of that tousled black hair draping over Song Lan's thigh made him scream. We'll meet you downstairs for breakfast in a moment, Xiao Xingden called after him, voice still throaty with sleep, and the sound of it filled him with another wave of rage, surely absolutely rage, only it made his eyelids sting uncomfortably, probably from the lack of proper sleep. Deliberately taking a wrong turn through the kitchens on his way to the courtyard, he swiftly appropriated a collection of small but sharp knives before a waiter vaguely familiar from the day before spotted him and hurried over to helpfully point him on his way. He still throbbed with the hunger to kill, itched with it, knew with single-minded ravenous hunger how very much better he would feel carving quivering flesh from bone to the soothing counterpoint of death rattles. Needed it to the deepest marrow of his own bones. The lazy thump of the heartbeats in the servant's throat in the kitchen behind him, deafening, an outright mockery. But Xiao Xingden had asked him, made him promise not to kill needlessly. He laughed at that, the hilarity of it, expecting barks of madness, and winced at the near whimpers that emerged instead. Had said wanted to believe that promise, the hopeless, naive idiot. The idiot who had spoken so softly the night before, said unforgivable things like, I'm sorry, and I didn't mean to hurt you, and I wanted to make sure you were all right, and is there anything you need? As though he still cared, as though something could still be salvaged from the ashes of the life Xu Yang hadn't even realized he couldn't be without, until it had already gone down in roaring flames. You, he wanted to whimper and beg like the most pitiful of street dogs. You, I need you you back, I need it all back. His chest constricted, and suddenly he couldn't breathe, the pathetic 7-year-old deep down wanting just to wail and scream, as though he hadn't learned that crying over the world's injustices only got you whiplashes and cartwheels, kicks to push your inconveniently broken body out of people's way. In the end, with an effort so great his vision swam with it, he swallowed down his bloodthirst unsated, tucked the knives away in his Tianquan sleeve, and settled for methodically wringing the necks of every stupid fat chicken in the courtyard instead. It didn't really help much. He stood quiet for a long while, once everything around him was dead, fingers sticky with blood and feathers, focused on the breath burning in and out of his lungs until he felt in control enough to be able to pass the kitchens again without ripping anyone's throat out with his teeth. Washing the blood and feathers off his hand, he finally went to make use of the outhouse, while absolutely pettily imagining that the bucket was, in fact, a certain dead man's stinky boots. And then he went back inside to join Xiao Xingjin and his hideous pet corpse for breakfast. Xiao Xingjin sipped his almost too hot tea, and it was the most delicious tea in the world. Even this early in the morning, other patrons were talking softly all around, and by marvelous coincidence, the murmur was the most pleasant sound in the world too. Zijin was at his side, and a short while later, another familiar presence approached and carelessly threw himself down to sit at their table, and everything really was right in the world. He smiled. "We haven't ordered breakfast yet. We weren't sure what you wanted." There was a brief silence that could be hesitation, or maybe just a shrug. "Doesn't matter. Let's go with chicken. I heard they have a sudden surplus they need to get rid of." There was a short, heated debate on the tenets forbidding meat eating at that statement, but he wasn't really listening, just let the cherished voices wash over him, still smiling. He had a purpose, a new dream, already half given form. Hope, genuine, for the first time in the longest time, given to him as a precious gift by the other two, both. And Zijin had kissed him. He felt almost giddy at the thought, had to hide the flushed, widening smile in his teacup for a moment. He had kissed Zijin, and Zijin had kissed him, with the same serious, thoughtful air he did everything else, and, lightning struck with the memory, he had to fight down the most undignified urge of his life to decisively straddle his companion's lap and kiss and kiss and kiss him again until neither one of them drew breath. It was all too easy to imagine the muffled noise of scandalized shock Zijin would make at such antics. In public! And he almost choked into his tea, masked the laughter with a discreet cough. "You're in high spirits today, Daojang?" Xu Yang's voice, and he wasn't entirely sure if it was accusing or amused, only that it lilted into something like a question at the end. "I am," he admitted with a smile. "Of course I am. I have many things to be glad and grateful for today." There was a short silence, and then, to his surprise, Xu Yang spoke again in that odd, choked, soft voice even Cheng Mei had rarely sported, almost uncertain. "That's good. It's good to see you happy." Suddenly Xiao Xingjin's heart ached, sharply, a cut of relief so deep his hollowed-out eyes stung with it. He had been crushed under the weight of impossible duty ever since his first reborn breath in that coffin in Yi City, knowing with excruciating certainty that the only possible course of action left to him was to eventually speak a death sentence he just couldn't. But yesterday the world had tilted and changed, as the floor of the universe sometimes would, gently suggesting another path. Xu Yang had freely offered his aid in helping them make the world better, kinder. Out of selfishness, he knew. Despite everything, he wasn't that naive. But that still meant his life would be a stronger force for good than his death. And that meant that he himself wouldn't have to make that awful, agonizing, impossible choice after all. He smiled back, putting all his warmth into it. There was hurt there, still, of course, endless hurt and bitter anger, but at least he didn't have to lie to himself anymore about the obstinate affection still scorching his heart, even after everything. "Let's eat," he said lightly. "We can go over the letters one last time and then head out to send them on their way." "Yeah, sure," Xu Yang agreed, sounding very distant, almost faint. "We'll do that. Courier boats down the river." "Should we stay here in Kuizhou until we receive a response?" Zijin said. "Or do we make our way east to Jinlingtai?" "Absolutely not," Xu Yang said, immediately sounding far more like his usual sharp, abrasive self. "We're not going anywhere near Jinlingtai until we have 3 promises in writing that we are officially invited, as honored guests, safety guaranteed." Xiao Xingjin felt himself frown, suddenly ill at ease. "Are you saying we would be in danger going there?" Zijin asked, voice hard. There was a slight sigh, but not the exaggerated, patronizing one he had been faced with on occasion, just something somewhat tired and annoyed. I told you last night, Lien Fangjuan holds magnificent grudges. He'll still be very upset with me for saying too much to the wrong people and losing that corpse of ours. And he gets pernicious when he's feeling petty. And even without all that, the whole place is a scorpion's den. We're not going near it until we know the letter got there and our new friend's protection has officially been oh so graciously extended. Not quite as straightforward a path as he had expected, or hoped for, Xiao Xingjin thought, and felt somewhat deflated, putting his teacup down. Ah, don't look so dejected, Dao Zhang. He'll bite. The bait's too tasty for him not to. You just need to be patient for a while. Your big dream's worth waiting for, isn't it? Helplessly, he found himself smiling again at the wheedling, teasing tone. Something so familiar his lips had twitched before he stopped to think about it. Of course, every journey begins with a first step. We'll send the letters today, scattering seeds. The future will show us what will grow from it. Sitchin said, sounding somewhat grim, even in the one humming syllable. We'll be cautious and move with discretion for now. And if this is you leading us into a trap, Xu Yang snorted sharply, in what could be amusement, offense, or somehow both. Yes, I know, horrible death and all that. I'm not in a rush to lose my head either. So let's go north, take the long way around. We'll be on the right side of the river, and once it's time to veer east, we'll go through Qinghe. Place is safe, the clan leader's an incompetent idiot. Much better than sitting around here, or splashing through the mud of Yunming. Sound good, Dao Zhang? Xiao Xingjin smiled weakly and spread his hands in a shrug. I wouldn't know. It's been a long time. If you think it's the best way, we'll take it. When I came from up north, Sitchin stated, and he could all but hear the thoughtful frown. The former Wen territory was still half a no-man's land, sliced up and scattered between petty clans. Easy enough to move through without any of the greater sects making trouble. It was a long time ago, though. I don't know what it's like now. Pretty much the same, Xiang agreed. Not quite as lawless as of late. Plenty of those fancy watchtowers all over. Enough to glare the petty local lords into submission, knowing someone's always watching. All nice and happy, thanks to our dear friend-to-be. He's very good at keeping the peace. Then we'll go north for now, and make our way from there, Zijin concluded, and Xiao Xingjin nodded his agreement. They went over the letters a few more times over breakfast, and a small childish part of him he'd all but forgotten fluttered with the same exhilarated dread and joy he'd felt when he had first turned his back on the mountain to descend into the mythical world below, half a lifetime ago. The first steps taken on a new, life-defining journey. At least this time, he thought, heart brimming with fondness. He wasn't walking into the future alone. Traveling 1,000 fucking li in one single day, Xiang sighed, as the courier boat cast off, gaining speed as it navigated past the throng of crafts on the great river. No taking that back now. Past 10,000 mountains, Songlan mentally filled in, looking after the swift craft and the momentous message it carried, not sure if he should feel elated or troubled. But Xingjin was smiling, animated with rekindled enthusiasm, and so he laid his doubts to rest for the time being. The future would arrive either way, whatever it held. Little point in worrying about it now. Can we get out of here now? Xiang said, sounding exaggerately bored, which, according to the internal encyclopedia Songlan's mind had begun piecing together in Tanzhou, much to his own chagrin, meant that he was probably uneasy. I hate this place. Xingjin nodded. We'll stock up on supplies while we have the opportunity, but then there's no reason to linger. Well, we're in the right place. Dog markets is the best place to pick things up for cheap. Just don't ask who the vendor stole it off, and you'll be fine. There was something nasty about Xiang's knife-slash smile, but Xingjin just shook his head in mild exasperation, still smiling, allowing the delinquent to lead the way ahead. Songlan had almost managed to make himself believe they might get through the market without incident, tucking the acquired food rations and medical supplies away in his jianquan bag, when Xu Yang paused at a stall and thoughtfully narrowed his eyes. "Oi, this pure silver?" The hawker was a small man, all limbs, somehow managing to look even ruddier than Xu Yang himself. Perking up at the attention, he quickly held several spoons of pale metal thread up for closer inspection, sweeping calculating eyes over the three of them and flashing an oily grin, missing half his teeth. "Sure, sure, of course, worthy Dao Shi. Only purest silver for our noble followers of the path. I know you care little for such worldly matters as money, but give me a blessing or two, and you'll get my best price, yeah?" Xu Yang scoffed and narrowed his eyes further, picking one of the spools up, unwinding a few loops of thread with his thumb. He did something, Song Lan wasn't sure what, but there was a strange smell and the thread suddenly burned red hot, then crumbled black, white, into ash. Xu Yang's eyes widened along with his smile, both suddenly flashing an alarming amount of white. "Oh, my friend, oh no," he said, almost singing the words, voice soft as smoothest silk. "Are you really trying to swindle me?" The hawker sputtered complaints at the casual demolition of his wares, shifted into weak protest at the words, only to abruptly cut off as Xu Yang leaned in closer, his fanged grin deranged. Song Lan laid his hand on Fushe with a soundless sigh, getting ready to intervene if things took a turn for the uglier. "Do you know what you just did? Lying to me? Do you know who I am?" Xu Yang breathed, and the vendor seemed utterly transfixed by those flashing eyes a hair's breadth from his own, barely gathering the wits to shake his head, a mouse trapped in the serpent's gaze. "I am the man who'll gouge your eyes out and stuff your testicles in the empty sockets for trying to sell me dirty tin alloy as silver," Xu Yang informed him, voice alight with laughter, promising death. The hawker made a high-pitched, keening noise, dropping the spools of thread he still held. Song Lan was fairly certain the man had just soiled himself. I have a knife," the hawker managed, after a few false starts, fumbling at his belt and drawing out a rather big and ugly-looking knife, jagged edge rusty with a friendly promise of gangrene. Xu Yang just laughed, madly, delighted, and leaned in further, crowding the terrified man even further back. "And you still have your testicles too. Let's see which you lose first." "That's enough," Song Lan told him. He was no more fond of fraudulent peddlers than anyone, but he wasn't going to let Xu Yang actually hurt people. Unbelievably, Xingjin stood serenely at his side and almost looked as though he was trying not to smile. Xu Yang didn't acknowledge he'd hurt him, but he did rock back marginally on his heels, letting the ratty man exhale. "I could go to another stall," Xu Yang said pleasantly, rhythmically flicking his nails at a quivering knife in front of his face with a dull, ringing sound, "and start this whole thing all over. But then this will have been a waste of my time. I don't like it when people waste my time. So if I asked you once more for real silver, you wouldn't waste my time again, would you?" The hawker quickly shook his head, looking ready to faint, groping blindly for something on a lower shelf behind the stall, and all but tossing a handful of spools and loops onto the counter. Xu Yang gave him a friendly smile and picked a few up, studied them with a matter-of-fact air, and finally thumbed another one open, making the thin strand between his fingers glow red-hot. This time it retained its shape and shine once the glow faded, and he nodded, seemingly satisfied. "See, that wasn't so hard, was it?" The victim briefly closed his eyes, then opened them again with one final pained look, clearly eager to cut his losses, anything to get Xu Yang out of his face, which was, overall, an understandable sentiment. A gift for the worthy masters. This humble one's so sorry to have wasted your time." Xu Yang smiled, a devilish child's smile of self-satisfied delight, and then Xingjin stepped forward and delicately placed a nugget of copper on the pile of discarded threads. "We couldn't possibly accept it. Please. Good fortunes to you and your business, my friend." "Dao Chang," Xu Yang complained, snapping around and rolling his eyes. "We've talked about this. Don't butt in on my haggling. It's rude." "Let's just leave," Sung Lan sighed, knowing that only the other two could hear him. "The poor man's terrified, and we don't want to draw the wrong kind of attention." "Ingrate," Xiang muttered, tossing him the spool of silver thread, and he caught it on startled instinct. "Carry it yourself. It'll work best if it's attuned to your energies by the time we stitch your flesh with it anyway." He had almost forgotten what the thread was for, and couldn't hold back a shudder at the thought of putting anything that Xu Yang had held into his mouth. Unconsciously wiping it at his sleeve, he put the spool away into one of his pockets. Somehow, they actually did manage to make the rest of their way through the market and onto the main thoroughfare without further disasters. Hopefully that meant Xu Yang had had his fun for one day and would keep himself in line at least until they left the city, and its abundance of innocent bystanders safely behind. Xiao Xingzhen. Torn from his thoughts, Xiao Xingzhen raised his head and listened in the direction of the voice. No one said his name quite like Xu Yang did, the lilt and drawn-out last syllable, amicably needling and familiar. "Yes? Won't you tell a story?" If he had still had his eyes, he would have blinked. Now? It was hard enough to navigate the crowded streets in focused silence, with Zhijian's hand on his. He didn't feel at all like doing it while making conversation. "Yes." "You hate my stories," he pointed out, still nonplussed. "It's been a long time. Maybe you've gotten better at it." He very nearly snapped, "What, while being dead?" But the request itself was so unexpected that he held his tongue, tried to sift the words for some deeper meaning. In his hesitation, he failed to pay attention, and a passerby walked into his arm. Just the lightest push, and he was already apologizing when there was a snarl and a sound of scuffling and stumbling. "Get out of the way, idiot!" Xu Yang growled, moving as though to follow up whatever had made the person stumble with further violence. "Don't," Zhijian said warningly, and the hand holding his stiffened, angry. "If you threaten one more person today, we'll drag you out of the city in chains." The low growl turned into a loud hiss of sheer fury, and he had fought alongside Xiang's past self on enough night hunts to know that gory bloodshed was the next step, one very, very small step away. "Please," he hurried to intercept, unconsciously stroking his thumb over the knuckles of the hand in his, soothing. "Please, let's not fight. There will be no threats, no chains. Let's just focus on getting out of the city. I can tell a story if you both help me keep track of where I'm going." He held out his free hand, and despite the ceaseless noise of the crowd, he had a feeling the world held its breath. "Okay," Xiang finally said after a long silence, and his voice was strange, choked. "Okay." It wasn't until the gloved hand slid into his, uncharacteristically hesitant, that he remembered he wasn't really supposed to invite that touch. But the hand slotted into his was tense, cold, and clammy underneath the rough edges of the leather, and he frowned. Wished he could just ask what was amiss, but knew better. "Once there were two friends," he started, and let the two hands guide him forward. It was easier to walk while letting them lead and shield him, not constantly having to sweep his senses ahead with so many people milling around. Soulmates who trusted each other in everything. The rest of the world faded somewhat, became something more distant, reduced to just the hands he held. How right it felt to hold each of them in his own. But one of them dreamed of accomplishing great things beyond human reach. She thought forbidden powers, a dangerous and questionable path. Though they talked of it often, and her friend tried to dissuade her, she couldn't let go of her ambitious dream. Her friend could only watch in growing despair as the desire for that forbidden power consumed her soulmate. "Careful," Zhijian said, gently nudging him slightly to the side. "We're approaching the city gate. It's crowded here." Startled back to the present, he could feel it, hear it, the bustle of people converging up ahead, footsteps and shouting, the loud clattering of the hoofs and creaks of wheels. The northern gate, on the road to Yueyang. A Chang clan leader must have come through here on his way home all those long years ago. A bothersome child lashed aside to end up under the wheels of his cart. Oh, he thought, understood, and wished he hadn't. It suddenly hurt a bit to breathe. They were both hurt in the end, he said, hoping his voice was steadier than it sounded to his own ears. The gloved hand in his was locked into a frozen claw, and if he allowed himself to pay attention to it, he knew the remaining fingers were slightly crooked, bones uneven where they hadn't healed quite right. The two friends clashed one last time. One tried to stand her ground to prevent the disaster, the other met her blade to blade. In the end, she went to claim the forbidden powers, but she was unable to control it. She gave her life, spending the rest of her spiritual existence in exile to contain the evil she had woken, to keep it hidden and the world safe. Her soulmate retreated to the mountains and left the world behind forever. They never met again. "You tell shit stories, Dao Zhang," Xiang said, and his voice was caustic and dark, every bit as awful and cruel as the last time they had spoken in Yi City, just before the pain of death. But the hand he held was cramped, holding onto his like a man drowning. He forced himself to smile, or at least stretch his lips into something like one. "I'm sorry. I guess I haven't gotten better at it after all." The crowd was pressing in all around, an echo against his senses as they were funneled through the gates. "It was Bao Shan Sanren, wasn't it?" Zichen asked. "Who was her friend?" "Lan Yi, the infamous lady sect leader of the Gusulan. She was brilliant, but her hunger and curiosity brought disaster on herself, and hers and my master's friendship." "And the power she sought?" "Yin Iron," Xiang said without hesitation. "The Eastern piece. She contained it, but with the seal broken, it started reaching out for the others. It took a long time for them all to wake up, but that was what started it, generations ago." "Yes," Xiao Xingde nodded, vaguely surprised. "How did you know?" The echoes around them subsided, and suddenly he could feel the wind on his face, carrying the smell of water and green open wilderness. Xuyang laughed, strangely soft. The hand in his was still tense, but the grip slowly turned gentler, more a friendly squeeze than clenched vice. "Lucky guess? Let's just say I know a thing or two about Yin Iron." The din of Koijo slowly receded behind them, fading into little more than a memory, or a bad dream. On the road, the overwhelming crowd thinned out, and having finished his story, he didn't really need the guiding hands anymore. Stubbornly, selfishly, he chose not to let go. Blooper. "We'll go through Qinghe, 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 Qinghe. We'll go through Qinghe, Qinghe, Qinghe. We'll go through Qinghe, Qinghe, Qinghe."